Maureen Callahan. Oh my gosh, I'm going to nerd out here. Maureen Callahan is an American journalist and author known for her work in pop culture and politics, and I am a huge fan. She's written for several popular publications that we quote right here, including the Daily Mail and the New York Post. That's where I discovered her, where she has been a columnist and features writer. Callahan is also the author of books such as Champagne Supernovas, Kate Moss, Marc Jacobs, Alexander McQueen, and the 90s Renegades Who Remade Fashion, An American Predator, The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer of the 21st Century. That actually examines the crimes of serial killer Israel Keyes. Her writing often covers a range of topics, from celebrity culture to true crime. But in Ask Not, the Kennedys and the women they destroyed, she marries political pop culture and true crime. It is the most fascinating book. I had so much to ask Maureen about her best-selling new book. I hope that you enjoy it, but I'm going to tell you right now, I forgot to ask her, and it's crushing my soul. I forgot to ask her, after all of this research, does she believe in the Kennedy curse? So because I forgot to ask her that, I'm asking you, take a listen to this interview, think back on what you know, read this book, but do you believe in the Kennedy curse? Please let me know in the comments below, because as I read all of these horrible stories, how do you not? But also, are these men just born with this reckless gene, with this arrogance? An incredibly fascinating book. I still love the Kennedy family, bizarrely, even after reading it. So if you love the Kennedys and you're fearful of that it'll change your mind, you can digest this information and they can still hold a special place in your heart, So don't fear that. But you are going to have some tough questions to ask about, the consequences, why they don't face them. So please enjoy this interview with Maureen Callahan. I had a blast talking to her. You almost had to rip me off the internet because I was like, oh, one more. And I still had more. Kennedy curse. I want your thoughts. Enjoy the interview. Thanks so much for watching. Maureen Callahan, congratulations on the success of Ask Not, the Kennedys and the women they destroyed. Ask Not, based on JFK's famous speech. Were you not petrified writing this book?
First of all, thank you for having me. And secondly, I think as a fellow post veteran, you kind of have to be a certain stripe, like a certain kind of person to work there. And fear, it can never really be part of the equation. I think you kind of actually have to relish the idea of coming forward with an opinion that may run counter to either conventional thinking or accepted history or whatever someone is trying to spin their way out of, be it like a scandal or, whatever. So that's the long way of saying, no, I was not scared.
That's great. Have you had any feedback from the Kennedys? Because specifically, we're seeing RFK Jr. kind of in fighting mode. Anytime something is said about him that he disagrees with, he finds a way to respond to it. But he's been suspiciously quiet throughout the launch of this book.
It's really interesting, isn't it? There's nothing he won't fight back on. No sort of controversial stance, whether it's vaxing or whatever. But this book specifically, which is for anyone who isn't really familiar with the premise, it's written as though it were a novel, but it's all true. So the reader is always in the heads and the hearts of these women. There are two women who relate specifically to Bobby Kennedy Jr. His second wife, Mary, who he gaslit, psychologically tormented. She caught him cheating when she discovered his quote unquote sex diaries, which destroyed her. And she commits suicide in 2012. And then there's also Martha Moxley, a 15-year-old girl who is sexually assaulted and savagely beaten to death. And he throws his money, weight, power and fame behind his cousin, Michael Skakel, who is tried, convicted. Bobby helps get that conviction ultimately vacated in Martha's murder. So there are two women who directly link to Bobby, and he's running for president, and he has yet to be asked about any of this still.
I think I was most invested in Mary Richardson Kennedy's story. I ached for her. And I've met RFK. I really, really liked him. But it's the perfect example of the rules being different for Kennedys. Anyone else that had such literal skeletons in the closet would not be given such a second chance, a presidential candidate second chance. Were you surprised at all when you saw that he was running? Because I imagine you were in the process of writing this book and doing your research.
I wasn't surprised to hear that he was running. I'm something of a student of his in a way. Like I read what he writes and I listen to what he has to say. He's very charismatic. He evokes his father. He looks like his father. He is an alpha Kennedy, I think, in every way except really being substantive, you know? I think what struck me most about really why people need to look really hard at this guy, like really hard, was what he did to his wife after she killed herself. He fought for her remains, had her buried in the Kennedy plot. A week later, he secretly, without telling anybody, not her siblings, not their children, to my knowledge, had her remains exhumed, had the coffin moved 700 feet away in the middle of the night to be buried alone on the side of a hill. And that to me says everything about his cruelty, his thirst for vengeance, what he thinks of women who he perceives to have humiliated him. This is like really scary stuff. And this is why the book is so relevant, because the line with Kennedy men who have sought the highest office in the land has always been, well, they may be problematic in their personal lives when it comes to women, but they are sure great at legislating for you, for the female part of the electorate. And I don't think both things can be true.
That really did devastate me, because you describe Mary as being hopelessly alone towards the end of her life. So how cruel in death to ensure that she continues to be hopelessly alone and lonely. I mean, that is just the ultimate cruelty. And you had actually talked to Meghan Kelly about how you had this part. This was a very sensational piece in your book, so much so Vanity Fair had fought for it. And, you know, out of nowhere, Vanity Fair decides to pull it, not pursue it. And you felt like a Kennedy, perhaps, a Kennedy contact was behind ultimately killing that Vanity Fair piece.
Yeah, I couldn't quite understand it, because they really, it was like a fight for weeks. There was another outlet that was involved in the mix, and so they got it finally and secured it. And then days before it was due to run, they said, we're not running it. I don't understand why. Now, I will say around the week the book was published, they ran their own investigation of RFK Jr. And there were allegations in there that are also very disturbing. But it still struck me as weird. Like, you could still run the Mary part of Bobby's story online. It could still be a companion piece. It's still as damning. You know, I think back to Harvey Weinstein, right? It wasn't like there were too many stories and we can't possibly run them. It was like, no, every story, every woman, there's room for it. Let's print it, publish, discuss, debate.
Yeah.
That was just a Hollywood movie mogul. I mean, we're talking about someone who wants to be president.
Exactly. Your description of Mary reminds me of Princess Diana, emotional, not worth the effort. Do you see the similarities there? Oh, she's too much. Let's push her to the side. Let's get her away.
Yeah, I mean, so this is Kennedy Playbook 101. When a woman becomes inconvenient, and I've dedicated this book to inconvenient women everywhere, because I think all
Thank
women
you.
know
Hi.
all women know what it's like to be made to feel as though you are inconvenient. They will attempt to label a woman who's causing them trouble as crazy. They will try to get them institutionalized. This happened to even Jackie Kennedy. Her husband shipped her off to a mental institution in the early days of their marriage, where she underwent 3 cycles of electroshock therapy in 1 week because she was upset that he was cheating on her. So they'll do that. Okay. Bobby Kennedy Jr. tried to do it with Mary. Her therapist told me in session together, Bobby said to her, I want you to diagnose Mary as mentally ill. And that therapist, Sheena Hankin, said, Bobby, I will not. Your wife is not mentally ill. She is depressed and she is angry, but she is not mentally ill. So that's a tactic. And then if you move forward and you go public with your allegations, maybe it's rape, maybe it's some kind of abuse, maybe it's some kind of power dynamic. They will shred your reputation in the public square. They are often aided and abetted by a mainstream media that is still in thrall to the Kennedy myth, to Camelot, to the idea of being close to any Kennedys who are seen to have any amount of power. And I think it's a very toxic, poisonous kind of dynamic that really needs to be flushed out of our system.
Yeah, absolutely. I felt a sense of guilt while reading. This is more of a statement than a comment, but I felt a sense of guilt while reading the book because I couldn't wait for it to be over so I could start it again. And that seems strange when some of these stories are sad, but I just was so touched by these women, and you paint them all, and it's exactly what you described, which I didn't realize at the time. I was reading these stories as these women, so that's fascinating that you did that. Can you tell me, and it's okay if you can't, but can you tell me the gorgeous royal we think slept with Bobby Kennedy? I mean, hints are welcome.
Oh my God, I wish I could tell you. So I wish I could tell you those diaries. I mean, I can only imagine Mary's devastation when she found these women, which, by the way, like it gets worse. Every detail that you can add to this makes it worse. So
Yes.
he lists these women. There are 3 major thick diaries. They're in the back in a ledger called cash accounts. They're listed by name, and then they're ranked 1 to 10. And it's not sexual performance, it's how far he went with them, which is this very juvenile attitude towards sex. Sometimes there are 2 or 3 women in a single encounter or a single day. Many of these women were in Mary's social circle, had been in her homes, had been maybe on family vacations with them. I mean, the level of betrayal you can't begin to imagine. And rather than seek to try to ease their way towards divorce, Bobby takes up with a famous Hollywood actress, Cheryl Hines, moves in with her, a stone's throw from the marital home. You know, it just starves her out, cuts off all of her money, all of her credit cards. She's wandering around this wealthy Westchester enclave at loose ends. Everybody's pointing at the once regal Mary Kennedy. Look at her, what a mess. She can't get it together. Poor Bobby. You know, it's like this feedback loop of like, these women just can't hack it. Of course they can't hack it. Carolyn Bessette, same thing, you know? Every time John would get on her for not being the perfect wife, she would say to him, I didn't get the effing employee handbook. And even his friends who maybe didn't like her that much had to concede she had a point.
That's so funny that you say that, because that was one of my notes. I thought that is so brilliant. I didn't get the employee handbook, because there are very unrealistic expectations for Kennedy girls. You talk about the uncomplaining cool girl. What are the kind of secret requirements to become a Kennedy wife?
You have to look the part. You have to sound the part, which usually means saying nothing, complaining not when your husband doesn't come home for days or weeks and you don't know where he is or who he's with. You have to be all in on selling what increasingly becomes a lie of a perfect American marriage and family. And you have to be willing to sacrifice any professional, personal ambitions you have on the altar of your husband's political dreams, desires, and career.
No big
Just
deal.
that. If you can do that, you're good.
Enjoy a life of misery, but you get to stand
Yeah.
next to, in some cases, a pretty handsome guy. I had no
Yeah.
clue that JFK Jr. almost hit a commercial flight on the night that he took that plane down. You give a very haunting description of the recovery of their bodies. I was so disappointed by the arrogance of JFK Jr. I mean, were you disappointed when you really got down to who he was? I think we still fantasize about this beautiful young boy.
I was kind of surprised and kind of not, honestly, Kinsey, because, you know, we just went through last week the 25th anniversary of that plane crash. And still, 25 years later, there's this gauzy coverage of poor John and, oh, what happened that night and the Kennedy curse. And as I sort of walk the reader through in the book, that plane crash was the inevitable outcome of a life he spent chasing death. Like, he had a death wish, and he would not only repeatedly get himself nearly killed in various catastrophic accidents, but he had a habit of bullying his girlfriends into coming along with him. So it wasn't just him. He had to bring the women in his life along. And it really irritates me. I mean, actually, irritate is too small a word. It actually enrages me that it's still unknown that he broke every single rule of aviation that night, that he did almost crash into a packed American Airlines commercial plane making its descent to New York City. That is a major detail to leave out of this story, of the condition of the bodies. Like, you know, doesn't it strike you as odd that we never really see the plane that they recovered from the ocean? You can find those images; they're out there, but we never see them.
It looks like a Coke can was smashed and run over 3 times.
100%. It looks like a xylophone or something that was just smashed together, and you can't even. It's so compressed and mangled. You can't even imagine that they were able to recover intact body parts. It just beggars belief. And so, of course, you know, you have Ted, patriarch of this mess, swooping in to get the remains cremated ASAP and to kill the autopsy report. You know, it's just, it's all, that's the real story. And I think we're adult enough to take the real story. I think we're healthier for the real story.
I feel like you could have written an entire chapter on Carolyn Bessette and Lauren Bessette's mother, Anne Freeman. She's actually referenced quite often in the book and seems to have her head on her shoulders. I was curious to know more about her and found this devastating article from the Cape Cod Times that read, "Friends say that Anne Freeman meets with close friends or attends small functions, but she is living a broken life." I know she's passed away now, but
no, she hasn't. She's still alive, actually.
Oh,
yeah, I know what you mean. There's another Anne Freeman whose ovid is out there. It's not their mom, though.
Well, that is so interesting to know, because what I wanted to ask you, aside from did she ever rebound or was she always the shell of a person, was how have they managed to stay so private when this, aside from the fact that this is such an insane story, the internet now has exploded. Social media has exploded. So how do they continue to remain so private? And why do they choose to, when they could do one interview and maybe take down the Kennedys?
It's so interesting. You know, I spoke to family friends of Carolyn and Lauren's about Anne in the days after the crash, and she was remarkably calm, and she seems to be a woman of really strong faith. She has never spoken. This is true. My supposition is that when she was in negotiation with the Kennedys for a monetary settlement, when the Freemans were considering bringing a civil case against them for the reckless deaths of Carolyn and Lauren, that whatever the reported financial settlement was $15 million. I am sure they were made to sign an ironclad NDA that, would claw back all of that money and then some if they ever spoke. But I also think that we are now in a far different landscape. We are in a post-Me Too landscape where people routinely do break their NDAs and are never sued because what they have to say is so damning that to sue anyone who's issuing these kinds of stories would look exceptionally heartless. So we'll never know, but there is a harrowing moment in the book the night before the wedding at the rehearsal dinner where Carolyn's mom stands up and gives a toast, and her toast is basically like, I don't think my daughter should be marrying this guy.
I'm not sure about you. Have a great marriage. I know, and to think that she had an instinct and it was so spot on, and she lost 2 of her babies. I mean, it's just so devastating, but you can't control your daughters when they are in love with a prince. I mean, he was America's most eligible bachelor, and poor Carolyn thought that she had caught the prize. Kit Kennedy is my favorite character throughout this book. I just absolutely love her. You discuss a message she sends home where she accuses Queen Elizabeth of looking a little chunky because of her wardrobe. Is that it? She's blunt. I think that's probably why I love her. What, did you learn anything else about her time with Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret, Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret at the time?
It's so interesting because the Kennedys really were on the ascendancy even in the run up to World War II. And, their father, Joe, who was a monster nonpareil, had been the U.S. ambassador to Britain. And so they were mixing with people like then Princess Elizabeth. And that remark about her weight was so cutting and bitchy, but also so understandable because Joe and Rose Kennedy, all they did constantly, like every day, those kids were measured and weighed. And, if they gained a pound, it was like a family scandal. And, but it's so interesting that she's your favorite because she, is so far back in time, but she was so modern and she was so witty and funny and brash, and the upper class of British, the aristocracy, they just loved her for her ability to sort of cut through niceties. And she lived kind of like a man. She did what she wanted. She married who she wanted. Consequences be damned.
Yeah, well, one of those consequences was losing support, all kindness, and contact from her mother. Kit was so protective of Rose when it came to her father's infidelities. How did Rose justify her cruelty towards her daughter? Did she not appreciate that support? Because reading about the way that they've treated women over the years, you're absolutely right. Kit did act as if she was one of the boys, but I would have been fearful to challenge Joe Kennedy. I would have been fearful to challenge my father. Did Rose not see the courage there? Did she not appreciate the fact that she, potentially could have been backhanded?
My theory about that dynamic, Rose attempted to leave Joe once, only once. And her father told her to go back home to where she belonged. She made that mess. She made that marriage. And I think in Kit, she saw a part of herself that she had snuffed out long ago, which was a rebel, which was an independent woman who was going to do what she wanted and live in a way that brought her the most happiness, even if others, including her own mother, disapproved. And, the thing that Kit shares in common with Mary Richardson, nearly 100 years later, is that when Kit is killed in an avoidable plane crash, her mother does not go over to her funeral. Her mother does not have the body flown back to America. She's happy to have Kit buried alone without her siblings in her former husband's family plot. And Kit's gravestone does not bear the last name Kennedy.
Well, I planned an entire trip dedicated to that chapter now, just so you know. I was like,
oh my God, that's incredible. You have to take pictures and send them to me.
Well,
of
come
the
with
grave
me.
especially.
I know. Now, Rosemary Kennedy was without a doubt, the most haunting story. Lobotomized because she wasn't perfect. You talk about them weighing these children regularly and the high expectations they had for Rosemary. And you even go into what potentially could have caused it. The fact that, she was, Rose was forced not to go into labor for hours. So could that have caused some of Rosemary's deficiencies? Talk to me about poor Rosemary. Did you feel like, first of all, I want to get into some of, I'm dancing around this because I want to know how you personally felt about the revelations you made about Joe potentially abusing this child.
Yeah.
I've seen this conversation happen online. Is it your instinct that this happened, or did you just want to make sure it was out there for people to consider?
It's not an instinct. It's actually based on reporting. So I want to make that clear because there's been some, in some reviews of the book, there's been an attempt to sort of minimize these stories as like gossip or just sordid, like picking through bones. And I think that's a very typical way to minimize the things that women endure and to sort of shunt it aside. With Rosemary Kennedy, so for this book, I went out to Wisconsin and I went to the cottage where she had lived out the bulk of her life and sat with the nurses who took care of her for decades at St. Coletta's. It was like 2 weeks before they were about to like raise that cottage. Rosemary had died. And she lived a very lonely life. Her father forcibly lobotomized Rosemary when she was in her early 20s. And she just vanished. Like the siblings had no idea where she was, what happened to her, if she was alive or dead. They hid her away successfully. And then when the press discovered this missing Kennedy, the Kennedy family machine put out an explanation of this lobotomy. And the story went that Rosemary had severe learning disabilities. And in an attempt to fix her, they overreached and subjected her to this operation that was supposed to be a corrective, but in fact left her worse off. That's a very polite way of saying what was done to her, which I think was worse than murder. She was left with the physical and mental capabilities of a 2-year-old. She couldn't speak. She couldn't toilet herself. She couldn't take a shower by herself. She couldn't feed herself. All the things that we take for granted. That why never really sat right with me. And as I was working on Rosemary's chapters, I came across a previously published biography of JFK, which was also extremely controversial at the time, but has stood up over the decades. It was called JFK Reckless Youth. And in that book, there is an assertion by Kennedy family friends that they long suspected that there was something very sinister going on with Joe in regards to Rosemary, and that he had possibly been sexually abusing her. And I followed that thread, and I felt very confident that it was true and it needed to be in the book. And since the book came out, I have since heard from someone else very close to the family that that is true, and that is something that the Kennedys talk about amongst themselves.
Oh, that just absolutely breaks my heart, because you also talk about how she's just thrown, before this lobotomy, she was just thrown from facility to facility. Like, they didn't care where she was, whether it was a summer camp or whatever. They just wanted her out of their sight. They didn't want anybody to catch on to perhaps the fact that she was a little bit slower than everybody else. And so that just makes me so irate to know that that's true, because you said in some of these facilities, perhaps people were inappropriate with her. I believe you said she tried to run away from some of them, or she was acting out at some of them, which wasn't like her. And so you wondered if somebody had tried to abuse her there too. But she was so unbelievably gorgeous. Without a doubt, the prettiest of the Kennedy clan. Can you talk to me a little bit about her tripping in front of the Queen? She was presented as a debutante before this lobotomy. She was presented as a debutante. This was and she was just being poor Rosemary.
Rosemary, they trained Rosemary. I mean, all the Kennedy girls who were going to be presented to the Queen, but Rosemary in particular, like, you stand this way, you speak this way, you say this at this time, you stay quiet. Like they put her through these drills, like militaristic drills. And she not only trips a little bit in front of the queen, which is a huge embarrassment to the Kennedy family, but then at this reception, she's flirting with boys. And this was a problem that Joe identified. Well, she flirts with boys. Boys like her. I mean, she was a beautiful, vivacious young girl. Of course she was. But with her, they couldn't, I think all the reporting in the book shows, and that the familial dynamics, the boys were so sexually incestuous. They shared women with each other, with their father. Whatever they did was considered like the ultimate in masculinity. But if a female Kennedy was at all comfortable with her sexuality or seemed to like sex, that was a major problem. And so the shunting of Rosemary off to these facilities where she was catnip for predators, to be sure, to be running out of a facility in the dead of night more than once, not knowing where she was or where she was going, should send up alarm bells. It shouldn't be like, wow, she's really out of control. That's a girl in real crisis. And the detail that really broke my heart was she's shipped off to this summer camp. She's like well into her teens, and she's growing so fast that like her feet are bleeding because her shoes are too small, which means that nobody in the Kennedy family or any of the numerous people they employ as help and nannies was paying attention to this girl suffering. Like the bleeding cut feet and the too small shoes are such a metaphor, I think, for what it is to be a Kennedy woman.
That is so true. I know that. Can I have a few more minutes with you? I don't know if you have to go anywhere, but I have so many questions. I loved this book. I can't tell you.
All right, my God, thank you.
Okay, so what do you know what happened to Letters from Rosemary with Emma Stone, with Sam Gold directing? Online sleuths wonder if the Kennedy family killed that film, and I wondered throughout your research if you'd heard something similar. But Rosemary was supposed to get her redemption film.
I have no idea what's going on with that movie. When I heard they were making it, I thought, this is amazing. You know, Rosemary is the Kennedy that most Americans know little to nothing about. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I can just tell you personally, when I was shopping this book as a proposal, I had editors who said, this book is important. It's going to be big. And I think everything she's saying here is true, but I can't do it. I can't kill the Kennedy myth, or we heard literally like my mom would kill me if I published this book, or I worked with Jackie. I can't touch it. Even now, there are major media outlets who will not cover it, as big as it is, because they either employ Kennedys or people at the top are friends with Kennedys. And it really makes me crazy because it's so immature, and it is such a dereliction of duty to not put forward a part of American history because you don't like it.
Yeah. And Kennedys all seem to be politicians or journalists, so we're kind of in a weird place.
Quote-unquote journalists. Our new political correspondent for Vogue, Jack Schlossberg.
That's the last question I have for you. Why is that Jack Schlossberg so annoying? That's literally what I have written down.
He's like peak Nepo baby. He's
100%.
like peak, like last generation off the assembly line defective product Kennedy, right?
He's Timu Kennedy.
He's like 31 and he's making videos on TikTok of himself shirtless, like speaking gibberish, like literal gibberish. And so this is what I would say. So like Vogue, for example, won't touch this book, right? So Vogue has just hired him. We are in the past 3 weeks have been the wildest in American political life since I don't know when. You would think their chief political correspondent would be all over this, would be posting and publishing. Like, where's Jack? What's he doing?
Yeah, well, he's choreographing a dance for TikTok is likely what's going
Oh,
on.
I shudder. I shudder.
All right, why was Marilyn Monroe the one that really got under Jackie's skin? Because Jackie gave other Kennedy wives the advice to just let it go, pretend it's not going on, because she had somehow mentally gotten there. But it was Marilyn that really drove her crazy.
I think for Jackie, Marilyn was a public humiliation,
Mm.
like a huge one. All the other women, and there are women that she also didn't know about, like the 19-year-old intern who's in the book. But she was sort of bred to be a woman of a certain class where like the most interesting husbands weren't necessarily the most faithful ones. And so it was like a trade-off. But Jack and the White House press pool and the national media, they covered all that up. So she was still able to put forward an image of dignity and an intact, happy, dignified marriage. But Marilyn Monroe in 62 gets on stage at Madison Square Garden for a fundraiser for Jack, and he's in the audience, dressed in this skin tight diamante gown and cooing happy birthday and all but announcing to the world that she and the married president of the United States are having an affair. And, Jackie had been through hell in that marriage up to that point.
Mm.
She had almost left him after he abandoned her when she gave birth to their stillborn daughter. She was alone in a hospital for 8 days while he was off partying.
Vacationing with women?
Yep. She had put up with a lot. And she knew that if she left him, he would never get a second term. She was like, I'm going to blow the lid off of you. Leave this, end this now, and never have a single communication with Marilyn Monroe again. And Jack did it. And what is also shocking is like the ease with which he did it.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't really care. Like,
Yeah.
I think about the way that Jack and Bobby Kennedy, then the U.S. Attorney General, who were both sexually involved with Marilyn at the same time. I mean, my dog treats his chew toys with more affection and concern than the way the Kennedy brothers treated Marilyn Monroe. And they absolutely contributed to her premature death at 36, which is still covered in mystery.
Exactly. Yeah. So you delve into the Marilyn murder theories. First of all, I had no idea that she had hooked up with Bobby prior to having been sewn into that dress, prior to singing Happy Birthday, Mr. President. Is that not wild to think? Because she's basically announcing to the world that she has an intimate relationship with the president while hooking up with his brother in the back. I cannot comprehend. I spent way too much time in a Southern Baptist church. But I also didn't realize that there was a potential baby. You write about a potential baby with Bobby.
Yeah.
Because there
Yeah.
are phone calls between Marilyn and Bobby 8 to his office. Those calls mysteriously are removed, disappear.
Yeah.
There's a recording of Bobby the day Marilyn dies in Los Angeles. He is angry. He's asking her for something, saying it's important to the family. Where did you, after all of your research, where did you land on the idea that the Kennedys might have had something to do with the death of Marilyn? Because you, earlier in the book, you say she did make some statements like goodbye. Like that does sound like suicide. But then at the end of the book, you get into some of these other details that make you go, well, maybe this was not as intentional as it initially sounded.
The Marilyn story, oh my God. So, just to go back to that beginning part of her having this tryst with Bobby before going on stage and singing to Jack, I really wanted to dig into Marilyn's psyche in those chapters, which is not hard to do. Like I say in the book, like you can find these women's stories if you just look hard enough. She kept journals her whole life. She wrote down her dreams. She wrote down things she said in therapy. Her therapists kept diaries that they released to the press after her death. And, Marilyn's simultaneous involvement with Jack and Bobby to me was extremely poignant because she was a child who had suffered so much abuse, sexual and otherwise, had gone through foster home after foster home, had sought love as like romantic love as the source of her ultimate healing. And in the attentions of Jack and Bobby, was able to feel as though she was the one thing she most wanted to be, which was smart. She wanted to be considered an intellectual. When they began disposing of her very cruelly, there are these phone logs that went missing in June of 62. And she's making frantic calls to Bobby at his office at the DOJ. And at that same time, there are reports that she had undergone an abortion at an LA hospital. And if you put those things together, why is she frantically calling Bobby? She has this abortion. Did she abort Bobby's baby? Looks likely. Did that further send her into panic, despair? Yes. The day of her death. So the FBI and the CIA are secretly bugging Marilyn's house because they know Marilyn's involved with both of them. She doesn't know this. Bobby suspects that it's happening. He shows up at Marilyn's house and is caught on these secret wiretaps, yelling at her, saying, "Where is it? Where is it? We need it. It's important to the family. Where the F is it?" There's a thump. It sounds like someone got hit. And then they leave. And she dies later that night of a suspected overdose. Her former husband, Joe DiMaggio, himself a very famous American icon, took control of her funeral arrangements, later said, quote, "I always knew who killed Marilyn, but I didn't want to start a revolution in this country."
Ooh. Oh my gosh, that gives me goosebumps. Did John or Bobby even react to her death, or did they keep a low profile at the time?
They kept a very low profile at the time. And in fact, it was Jackie Kennedy who exhibited the most sympathy for Marilyn.
Wow.
After her death. And she actually, it's not in the book, but Marilyn's ex-husband, Arthur Miller, a vaunted American playwright, wrote a play about Marilyn that went up on Broadway. It was called After the Fall. And it was very disparaging towards Marilyn. And Jackie is on record as saying to friends like that she thought what Arthur Miller did to Marilyn was disgusting.
Ooh, good for her. Yeah, because Jackie really is like kind of the hero at the end of the book. You're feeling so good about her. I've heard that she did not like Princess Diana. You mentioned the meeting in the book. Do you know Jackie's opinion of Diana? They were very different women.
You know, Jackie's so interesting, and I'm so glad to hear you had that reaction to her, because I do believe that Jackie's the heroine of the book, and the readers will meet three different Jackies. There's Jackie, the First Lady. There's Jackie, the 70s era trophy wife. And then there's Jackie, the liberated, single New York City working woman, who is my favorite Jackie. I love that Jackie. But she knew as part of her job, she became a book editor, that they were going to use her fame to try to sign the most famous people on the planet into book deals. Diana was one. She didn't want to go take that meeting. She took it. I don't think she ever really felt that was a consequential individual, like in terms of just her personal gravitas. She was also sent to go try to sign Michael Jackson. She had to fly out to Neverland and go to his house, and she found it all extremely creepy. She landed that book, but she found him she did not like him. She didn't really want anything to do with him. Jackie much preferred the trips like to Russia, where she could go like deep into archives about like Russian ballet, Russian architecture, czars, and Russian history. That was Jackie, and it's so interesting because she was like a Warholian American icon. Like she got fame and she really liked being famous, but she really was also an intellectual and a loner.
I wish Meghan Markle would listen to this book. Her life is a cakewalk compared to Mary Richardson Kennedy or Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Meghan has someone that has little to no, or with Prince Harry, there are little to no expectations. He's just like, be you, I love you, you're gorgeous, you're great. He's obsessed with her. Are there similarities to marrying in the British royal family? when it comes to marrying a royal versus marrying a Kennedy, because what she has described to us is similar to some of the stories in your book, but not to the crazy extent, maybe like 1 inch.
Right. And, I do take a lot of what Meghan says with like a huge multiple pounds of salt, because so much of what she has said has been proven to be untrue. But I think the thing that unites these women, and the one thing I will say about Harry choosing Meghan, is that you need a woman who wants that level of fame. Not every woman wants that level of fame and scrutiny, or can handle that level of fame or scrutiny. And it's a very specific kind of fame, because it's attached to your husband's fame, right? So it's almost like fame by proxy. It's not necessarily anything you did or achieved, whatever. I think Kate has, until this recent health crisis, she was always sort of, at least in a lot of American press, sort of disparaged as kind of like a perfect Stepford wife. Like, she looks perfect. What does she do? We don't really know. She doesn't speak about anything. She doesn't have any controversial causes. But now we're sort of seeing that she's kind of perfectly built for this job. You kind of have to be perfectly built for this job. I mean, I think that this book, I would hope it would disabuse anyone of thinking like a marriage like this is going to be a route to any kind of personal satisfaction. I think that's why we're seeing Meghan like scratching so desperately, trying to get purchase on any kind of cultural relevancy that doesn't have to do with her title or her marriage, right? She's going from like Netflix show to podcast to documentary to cooking show to preserves, jarring jam and shipping it all. Like, she's trying to find something that's hers alone. And I think that there's really something that's like a warning sign. It's instructive, I think.
Oh, that is so, I love that you said that, because you'd also discuss Jackie, Gloria Steinem, who Meghan loves, talking to Jackie refusing to use her political influence, which is a power within itself, refusing to use this thing that just you could effortlessly use at the drop of a hat, and God knows how the huge percentage of the country that would follow your lead. I think Meghan will endorse Kamala, and especially after what you just said, how she's just like, clawing for any sort of relevancy. Do you think that she would endorse Kamala Harris, or even officially endorse a political candidate?
That is so fascinating. That is such a great question. Just to circle back to Jackie for a second, in regards to her, like, she privately backs the Equal Rights Amendment, but she wouldn't publicly do it. She didn't want to use her fame for political purposes. She used it elsewhere. I think Jackie felt she gave it the office back in 1961 when she endured what she did. Yeah. But I think Meghan, that is a very interesting question, because there were reports, I don't know if you remember this, but a couple of years ago, she was cold calling senators on the Hill. And these senators, a lot of them were women, were like, how did you get this number? Like, how did you get my number? And why are you calling me? You're not even earned your stripes.
And introducing herself as the Duchess of Sussex, not like,
oh my God, is that not the best?
Yeah.
An American citizen, but I'm the Duchess. Please refer to me as such. That's my favorite thing. The Duchess of Sussex. Oh my God. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, because they're threading a needle, right? There are reports that seem extremely credible that Harry wants his way back into the family. His father seems to be extremely ill with cancer. Doesn't look good. Kate is not, she's struggling. She looks like she'll be fine. But it seems like he's having a very lonely life and is trying to get his way back in. If Meghan goes rogue and tries to insert herself into American politics, that makes Harry's path back that much more difficult.
Oh, that's a great point.
So they're kind of in this like corner. They've painted themselves into this weird corner. Like, what are they? Are they
story of their lives?
Story of their lives.
Yeah.
Story of their lives. I mean, what astonishes, because I think Meghan Markle looks at, like, she's clearly modeled herself in many ways on Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. Yes. Like, even the clothing, the self-presentation. You would think, as a student of celebrity, that Meghan would be able to think like 3 to 12 steps ahead. But she can't. You would think by now she would be like, oh, I can't think that far ahead. I should hire somebody who can think that far ahead. But she can't do it. There's nobody she will listen to. I call them all the time. I think Meghan Markle is one of our greatest living performance artists. Like, I can never wait to see what she does next.
That is absolutely hilarious. All right, one more question. I know my producer's going to kill me, but one of the biggest takeaways from the book for me is that you said Jackie once told her children, if their father returned, if this was in another, in some parallel universe, she didn't know if she would take him back. She didn't know if she would still be with him. That blew my mind. That fairy tale has completely collapsed.
Yes, and that is the Jackie of 1980s New York City, who has been through 2 abusive marriages, has silently vowed to herself that she's never getting married again. This is a radical thing in the 80s. And says, you know what? I don't think I would allow myself to be treated that way. Like, all of JFK's dirty laundry was beginning to be aired, and I think she wanted more for her children than that as the idea of a perfect marriage, because it wasn't. And she really did suffer a lot, not just for her family, but for her country.
Oh, this is the best book. Like I said, I finished it. I'm going to start it all over again. Maureen Callahan, congratulations. Ask Not: The Kennedys and the Women They Destroyed. It's the most brilliant book this year. Get it while you can, because it keeps selling out everywhere. It's available 24/7. Wow, Maureen, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I'm such a fan of your work.
Oh my God, Kinsey, thank you so much. What a great conversation. I could talk to you for hours. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.